I am Gerald Whitmore. I am 70 years old and somehow still working through the deepest betrayal a father could ever endure. As the founder of a multi-million-dollar commercial heating and cooling empire, I gave everything I had to building a legacy that would take care of my family. Last month, at an upscale dinner held to honor my late wife, my son slammed his scotch glass down on the table, jabbing a finger straight into my face. "Stop wasting my money," he hissed. I did not scream. I simply held his gaze in dead silence. The very next day, I emptied every single bank account he believed he controlled, and I vanished completely. Indianapolis, Indiana. A bitterly cold Tuesday evening in November. The kind of freezing wind that cuts straight through your overcoat and burrows deep into your bones, much like the grief I still carried with me every single day. We were seated in a dimly lit high-end steakhouse downtown. I was paying, of course. Welcome back to Dadrevenge, the place where fathers who fought back finally get to tell their side of the story. If these stories stay with you after you hear them, I'd be glad if you'd subscribe and give this one a like. It helps more people find their way here. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Right from the start of this story, is there already someone you find yourself quietly pulling for? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. One quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of telling it well. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that matters. I always paid. That dinner was meant to be something sacred. We had gathered to mark the 3rd anniversary of my wife Loretta's passing. Loretta was my absolute rock. She was the woman who stood beside me when I was just a kid in my 20s, hauling heavy industrial air conditioning units out of a rusted Dodge van. Back then, I was splitting my knuckles open every single day, grinding through 90-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. She was the beating heart of our family, the quiet strength behind Whitmore Commercial HVAC. Together, through decades of sheer grit and relentless sacrifice, we turned that tiny operation into a $40 million enterprise. Now seated at this lavish table, it was just me, my 35-year-old son Caleb, and his wife Vanessa. Caleb had stepped into the role of chief executive officer of the company exactly 1 year prior. I had pulled back, accepting the title of chairman, convinced the time had finally come to hand the reins to the next generation. Vanessa, a former real estate agent with a dangerous appetite for flashy designer labels and exclusive country clubs, sat beside him. She was lazily nursing a $35 glass of imported wine, looking bored and utterly indifferent to the emotional weight of the evening. The restaurant itself was refined and calm. Soft piano music played in the background. Crystal glasses clinked in toasts and waiters glided quietly through the dining room. But our table felt suffocatingly heavy. There was a thick, toxic tension hanging over us that I had been working to ignore for months. Caleb had grown distant, strange, and increasingly arrogant, yet I had kept making excuses for him. I told myself he was simply adapting to the enormous pressure of running a massive corporation. I was wrong. When the waiter cleared our entrees and poured the last of the wine, it felt like the right moment to share something personal. It was a decision that had given me a rare flicker of comfort during a brutal week of mourning. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and drew out my personal leather-bound checkbook. I placed it gently on the crisp, white tablecloth. I looked directly at Caleb, searching his face for any trace of his mother. "I have been thinking a great deal about your mother this week," I said, keeping my voice steady and low. "You know how much she loved St. Anthony Community Church. That old building has been struggling with a collapsing roof for over 5 years. Loretta always talked about doing something about it. So tonight, to honor her memory, I am going to write a check for $50,000 from my personal savings account to cover the complete restoration of that roof." I expected a quiet nod of approval. I expected a shared moment of grief, some small acknowledgement of the remarkable woman who had given him life. I expected my son to recognize that this was a deeply personal tribute to the very foundation of our family. Instead, what I got was instantaneous, visceral, and violently explosive. Caleb seized his heavy crystal Scotch glass and slammed it down with such savage, uncontrolled force that the stem shattered clean in his grip. The sharp, cracking report of breaking glass rang out through the elegant dining room. Patrons at nearby tables broke off their conversations and turned to stare. Jagged shards of crystal ice cubes and amber liquid scattered wildly across the white linen, bleeding into the pristine fabric like a dark, ugly stain. Caleb lunged aggressively forward across the table, invading my space. His face had gone a deep, furious red, the veins along his neck straining against his expensive silk tie. He drove his index finger directly at my face, his eyes wide, manic, and completely unhinged. "Stop wasting my money." He spat the words with a venomous, guttural intensity that carried easily over the soft piano music. "What the hell are you doing writing 50 grand checks to a useless church? Are you losing your mind?" Beneath the table, I heard a sharp, painful thud. Vanessa had kicked his shin hard, her eyes darting frantically around the room, rattled by the unwanted stares of wealthy onlookers. Caleb flinched from the blow, but his furious, hateful glare stayed locked entirely on me. He was breathing hard, chest-heaving beneath his custom Italian suit jacket, a jacket paid for entirely by the empire I had built from nothing. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands. I did not shout back. I simply went completely still, staring into the eyes of an absolute stranger sitting across from me. The words rang through my mind with a deafening, paralyzing force. My money. He had just claimed my personal savings, the money I had bled and sweat for over 4 grueling decades, as his own. I had spent 28 years breathing in toxic fiberglass insulation. I had frozen on commercial rooftops in the dead of winter. I had sacrificed my own youth and health so he would never have to taste the bitterness of poverty. I had stepped away from the daily grind for just 1 single year. And in that unbelievably short span of time, his entitlement had mutated into something terrifyingly monstrous. He genuinely believed he owned my wealth. He genuinely believed he owned me. The silence that followed was suffocating. The whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the older man to explode, to cause a scene, to put the disrespectful son firmly in his place. But I am not a man who fights in public. I am a man who observes, calculates, and then executes. I slowly reached out, picked up my checkbook, and slipped it back into my breast pocket. I did not offer a single word of anger or defense. I rose from the table unhurriedly, my posture perfectly straight. I reached into my wallet, pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills, and laid them on the soaked, glass-covered tablecloth to settle the ruined meal. I turned my back on my son and his wife. I walked out of that restaurant, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping out into the freezing Indianapolis night. The bitter wind struck my face, but I barely registered it. My mind was completely clear. My heart, though shattered, was beating with a cold and terrifying new purpose. I knew right then, without any doubt whatsoever, that the war for my life had already begun. I would not be a victim. I would be the architect of their complete and total destruction. I was up before dawn the following morning. Decades of rising at 4:30 to load trucks and review blueprints had permanently rewired my internal clock. The house was painfully silent. It was a sprawling brick estate in Carmel that Loretta and I had bought 20 years ago. Without her, it felt like nothing more than an empty museum. I brewed a pot of black coffee and settled at the kitchen island, watching frost cling to the bare branches of the oak trees in the backyard. My mind kept replaying the events of the night before. Caleb shattering the glass, the rage blazing in his eyes, that terrifying sense of entitlement. My money, he had said. The coffee tasted like ash on my tongue. By 8 hours, the winter sun was barely cutting through the heavy gray Indiana clouds. That was when the brass knocker on my front door thundered through the quiet hallway. I was not expecting anyone. I set my mug down, deliberately crossed the expansive foyer, and pulled open the heavy front door. Caleb and Vanessa were standing on my front porch. The freezing wind was whipping Vanessa's perfectly styled blonde hair across her face. Caleb was holding a massive, shrink-wrapped Wolferman's gift basket complete with an oversized, ridiculous silver ribbon. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin carrying the pale, clammy look of a man who had spent the whole night working through a severe Scotch hangover. Vanessa, by contrast, was impeccably put together in a tailored cashmere coat, clutching a pair of expensive leather gloves. She wore a bright, painfully forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Dad," Caleb said, his voice hoarse and remarkably smaller than the booming rage he had unleashed at the steakhouse. "Can we come in, please? We really need to talk to you." I studied them for a long, heavy moment. My instincts, the same ones that had pulled my company back from the brink during 3 separate economic recessions, told me to close that heavy wooden door directly in their faces. But a good businessman never shuts a door until he knows precisely what the person on the other side is trying to sell him. I stepped back in silence, pulling the door wide to admit the freezing air and my uninvited guests. They moved into the warm foyer, carrying with them the scent of expensive perfume and nervous sweat. Caleb practically shoved the heavy gift basket into my hands. I took it, feeling the absurd weight of the overpriced pears and gourmet cheeses, and carried it into the kitchen. I set it down on the granite counter without touching the ridiculous silver ribbon. I gestured toward the living room, guiding them into the formal sitting area that Loretta had filled with so much love. I settled into my usual armchair by the fireplace. Caleb and Vanessa perched tightly together on the edge of the long leather sofa, looking like 2 guilty teenagers hauled into the principal's office. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating. I did not offer them coffee. I did not offer them water. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited for one of them to speak. In negotiations, the first one to crack is almost always the one who loses. I had the patience of stone. Caleb broke first. He hunched forward, planting his elbows on his knees, and buried his face briefly in his hands in a small, theatrical gesture. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry about last night." He started, his voice heavy with manufactured remorse. "My behavior at the restaurant was completely unacceptable. I was out of line, and I deeply regret causing a scene, especially on the anniversary of Mom's passing. I know how much last night meant to you." I remained perfectly still, my expression giving nothing away. I offered no nod of forgiveness. Caleb swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably against the leather cushion. "It is just the stress, Dad. The pressure of running Whitmore Commercial HVACs is eating me alive. We are pushing into the Louisville and Cincinnati markets at the same time, and supply chain problems are creating massive delays on our industrial rooftop units. I have not slept a full night in 3 weeks. Last night I had far too much scotch on an empty stomach. When you reached for that checkbook to give away $50,000, I just panicked." I snapped. "I felt like the full weight of the company was crushing my chest, and I took it out on you. Please, you have to believe me. That is not who I am." I did not mean those words. I listened to every excuse, analyzing each syllable. He was blaming the alcohol. He was blaming the supply chain. He was blaming the very company I had built from nothing and handed over to him on a silver platter. He was taking absolutely zero genuine accountability for the hatred and entitlement that had poured out of his mouth. Before I could even begin to respond to his hollow apology, Vanessa smoothly leaned forward and rested a manicured, comforting hand on Caleb's knee. She looked at me with an expression of profound, sickeningly sweet concern. "It is the absolute truth, Gerald," she said softly. Her voice was pure velvet, dripping with calculated empathy. "Caleb has been working himself into the ground trying to make you proud. But honestly, we have both been deeply worried about you lately. You have been living alone in this enormous house for 3 years now. Grief does strange things to the mind." My heart settled into a slow, cold rhythm. I looked at her. "Worried about me?" I said, my tone dangerously flat. "Yes. Vanessa continued without missing a beat. You are so generous, Gerald. Sometimes too generous. We have been reading these troubling reports about elder fraud, about scammers and shady organizations preying on wealthy older men who live alone, people who exploit grief to extract large donations. When you pulled out your checkbook last night to hand over 50 grand to that old church, Caleb panicked because he wants to protect you. He meant to say our family money, not his money. He was simply terrified that strangers were taking advantage of you. She smiled, tilting her head with a look of practiced maternal concern. It was a brilliant, entirely plausible lie. She was reframing my act of charity as a sign of vulnerability and recasting Caleb's violent outburst as an act of protective love. That is why we quietly took the necessary initiative to set up a family protection trust last week, Vanessa added smoothly. Simply to shield your personal assets from potential scammers. It is a very standard and necessary precaution for older high-net-worth individuals. I nodded slowly, letting the hard lines of my face soften, pretending to accept their seemingly sincere apology. But deep inside my chest, 4 decades of corporate instincts were screaming a deafening warning. The phrase "family protection trust" rang in my head like a tolling bell. After they finally left, taking their hollow apologies and their expensive gift basket with them, the silence of that massive estate pressed down harder than before. The air in the foyer was thick with the lingering scent of Vanessa's perfume and the bitter aftertaste of their rehearsed performance. I needed to clear my head. I needed to be somewhere that felt real, somewhere far removed from the polished granite and the suffocating quiet. I walked out to the detached garage and pulled the canvas cover off my vintage 1975 Chevrolet pickup truck, deep blue. It was the very first vehicle I had ever bought brand new with cash earned from the HVAC business, meticulously maintained, completely free of modern touchscreens and digital trackers. Getting behind the wheel always brought me back to who I truly was, before the millions, before the corporate boardroom, before greed had infected my family. Just a machine of pure steel and combustion, honest and uncomplicated. I turned the key, and the heavy engine thundered to life, filling the garage with the rich smell of exhaust and worn leather. I reversed the truck out into the freezing Indianapolis afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, heavy with the threat of snow. I drove toward the industrial end of town to a small independent mechanic shop owned by a man named Leonard. Leonard was a man who worked with his hands, someone who understood the true cost of hard labor. I had booked a simple winter tune-up a few weeks earlier, nothing major, just fresh spark plugs, clean oil, and a quick look at the heating core. The drive was cold, but deeply grounding. The heavy steering wheel and the manual transmission demanded my full attention, giving me at least a brief reprieve from Caleb and his family protection trust. I pulled into the gravel lot, the tires grinding loudly over the frozen stones. Leonard wiped his grease-stained hands on a red shop rag and greeted me with a warm, easy smile. We spent the next hour talking about engines, the coming winter storms, and the enduring reliability of classic American manufacturing. It was a straightforward, honest exchange. No hidden agendas, no calculated words, just 2 men talking about things that made complete and perfect sense. When the work was done, Leonard stepped behind the scratched wooden counter to ring me up. The mechanic shop tune-up total came out to exactly $390, a trivial sum for a man in my financial position. I reached into my leather wallet and produced my heavy black card, a private wealth management card tied to an account with no preset spending limit, backed by a vast reservoir of liquid cash I had built up over decades of relentless work. I handed it to Leonard. He took it, pausing for just a moment to feel the solid weight of it, then swiped it through his dusty payment terminal. We kept talking about the local college football scores while the machine worked. A few seconds later, the terminal let out a sharp, harsh, negative beep. Leonard frowned and glanced down at the small screen. He wiped the magnetic strip on his apron and ran the card again. The machine beeped once more. The exact same flat, unforgiving sound. Leonard looked up at me, an apologetic and visibly embarrassed expression crossing his weathered face. Gerald, I am really sorry, he said, dropping his voice so the other mechanics across the garage would not hear. The machine is saying the card is declined. I stared at him, completely unable to process it. Declined. That single word landed like a physical blow. I had millions of dollars sitting in that specific account, an account I used solely for personal expenses, entirely separate from the corporate finances of Whitmore Commercial HVAC. Not once in my entire adult life had I ever had a card declined. The sheer impossibility of it made my chest tighten suddenly. I forced a calm, composed smile, masking the sharp spike of anxiety surging through me. It must be a security flag, I told Leonard, evenly sliding my phone from my pocket. The bank sometimes freezes the card when it detects unusual activity. Give me just a moment, Leonard. I will call my private wealth manager directly and have it cleared up right away. I pushed out through the garage door into the raw winter air, cinching my wool coat around me. My first call was to Stuart, the senior banker at a major national institution, who personally managed everything I owned. Under normal circumstances, Stuart picked up before the second ring, practically falling over himself to be useful. Not this time. The line just kept ringing. 5 times. 6. 7. Then a click. Stuart's voice came through, but it was unrecognizable, stripped of every trace of its usual polished assurance. What I heard instead was shallow breathing and barely contained terror. "Hello, Gerald." He managed the words, stumbling out in a heap. "Stuart." I made sure my voice was iron. Quiet, but iron. I am outside a mechanic's garage in this freezing cold, and my card just got turned down on a charge under 400. Whatever hold is sitting on my accounts, I need it removed. Now. What followed was a silence so complete it felt like the line had died. Then I heard him gulping air, steadying himself for something he clearly dreaded saying. "Gerald, I am truly sorry." He breathed barely above a whisper. Lifting that hold is not something I am able to do. That authority has been taken out of my hands entirely." The wind knifed across the gravel raw against my face, but nothing outside me came close to the cold that had just moved in underneath my ribs. "What do you mean it has been taken out of your hands, Stuart? Tell me exactly what you mean. That is my money in those accounts." "Gerald, you need to hear what I am about to say." His voice had dropped even further, urgent and hushed. Early this morning, Caleb arrived at my office with 3 corporate attorneys at his side. They handed me a court order bearing a judge's signature. This was not a fraud flag. Every personal account in your name has been frozen pursuant to a co-conservatorship filing. Caleb now holds temporary emergency authority over your personal finances. A conservatorship against me. A man in full command of his faculties, sharp as he has ever been. The bottom dropped out of my chest as the truth of it hit. That pretty little story they had rehearsed in my living room that morning, the concern, the tearful apology, the talk of protecting me from scammers, it exploded into dust. The so-called Family Protection Trust had nothing to do with shielding my assets from the outside world. It was a legal trap, architected from the beginning, to dismantle my autonomy piece by piece. They had not come to protect me. They had come to own me. And they had managed it quietly behind a judge's desk before I had even finished my morning coffee. I ended the call and just stood there, the wind working at me from every direction. The frozen gravel beneath my feet felt strangely unreliable, as though the ground itself had been quietly rearranged. A conservatorship. That word kept reverberating, cutting through the background clatter of the shop behind me. Caleb had not merely put a freeze on my checking accounts. What he had done was far more surgical, a precisely targeted legal maneuver designed to sever me from my own autonomy. To the state of Indiana, I was no longer Gerald Whitmore, founder and patriarch. I was a ward, a vulnerable elderly man requiring supervision courtesy of the very son I had handed an empire to. I was not going to stand in a parking lot and fall apart. Panic belongs to people who never saw this coming. I got back into the cab of my 1975 Chevrolet pickup truck, hauled the door shut behind me, wrapped both hands around the wheel, and put it in gear. I needed to see how deep the rot had gone. I needed to understand the full geography of what had been done to the company I had bled to build. I pointed the truck downtown, threading through streets glazed with gray slush, moving on instinct and purpose. The destination was the glass and steel tower that bore the name Whitmore Commercial HVAC. 20 years ago, I had stood in the mud and watched them pour the foundation. Every beam in that structure, every concealed shaft and maintenance corridor, I knew them without a blueprint. That building was the physical proof of everything I had given my life to. But pulling up to it now, watching it loom against a colorless winter sky, I felt none of that pride. What I felt was the particular dread of a man approaching a home that has been seized by strangers. I left the truck in the adjacent garage well away from my usual spot by the main entrance. I was not announcing myself. I came in through the front glass doors and crossed into the marble lobby, letting the hum of ordinary business life wash past me. Soft phones, quick footsteps, the murmur of people absorbed in their own transactions. Not one person looked twice at the 70-year-old man making his way toward the rear of the building. I gave the main reception desk a wide berth and made straight for the executive elevator bank, the restricted access corridor reserved for senior leadership. From my coat pocket, I drew the gold-trimmed founder's badge, the one credential in this entire building that was supposed to be mine unconditionally, a master key to every secured room, every floor, every digital system on the network. I pressed it to the scanner on the elevator panel and waited for the green light. The machine answered with a flat, ugly beep. Red. The panel read, "Access denied." I tried it again. Same beep. Same red light staring back at me like a small, contemptuous eye. Access denied. It landed like cold water thrown directly into my face. Caleb had not stopped at the bank accounts. He had gone into the corporate security system and scrubbed me out of it entirely. Inside the walls I had financed and filled, I was now a nobody. My expression gave nothing away. I eased back against the marble wall, folded my arms, and waited just another face in the lobby, apparently killing time before a meeting. I studied the movement of staff through the turnstiles for about 10 minutes. Then I spotted my opening, a young, incredibly nervous-looking intern, listing badly under a tower of cardboard boxes with 4 coffees balanced on top, fighting with his lanyard and losing. When he finally wrestled his badge across the reader and the light went green on the standard elevator bank, I moved. Smoothly, without hesitation, with a decisiveness that had nothing to do with my 70 years. I fell in right behind him and slid through the turnstile a half-second before the barrier closed. The intern lurched, boxes swaying, and threw a panicked look back at me. I met it with the unhurried confidence of someone who owns the building, because I do. "Easy, son," I said, one hand going to the top box to steady it. I came down without my badge. "Do me a favor and press the executive floor." He stabbed the button with a trembling finger, nodding the whole time. He had no idea he had just let the building's rightful owner back inside. The car rose without a sound, delivering me to the floor where the real decisions get made. The doors opened. I moved down the carpeted executive hallway, the way I always have, purposeful, unhurried, silent. Framed photographs of our largest installations lined the walls on both sides. I passed the boardroom without a glance and went directly to the corner office that had always belonged to my chief financial officer. Through the gap in the blinds, I stopped and looked. Vanessa was behind my CFO's mahogany desk. My son's wife, who has never held a corporate title, never earned a business degree, never spent a single day learning how this industry operates. She was reclined in the leather chair as though it had been built for her, a glass of sparkling water at her elbow. The first thing I clocked was her left wrist, a brand-new diamond-encrusted Rolex costing approximately $18,000. But the watch was almost beside the point. Across the desk lay stacked files of legal paperwork, and I placed the watermarks the moment I saw them. She had a heavy gold pen, moving across the pages, signing real estate transfer deeds on Whitmore letterhead one after another. She was converting my company's physical holdings into cash. Warehouses, distribution facilities, properties I had spent decades acquiring, quietly being sold off, the proceeds almost certainly being redirected into offshore accounts they had built in the shadows while I was busy grieving my wife. My chest was on fire. My mind was perfectly still. I did not open that door. I had no intention of bursting through that office door to confront her. Confrontation without leverage is nothing but noise, and what I needed was absolute leverage. I burned the image of that scene into my memory, turned on my heel, and moved silently back down the carpeted corridor. The quiet, catastrophic battle for my survival had truly begun. I climbed back into the heavy vintage Chevrolet and pulled onto the interstate, putting distance between myself and the gleaming towers of the downtown business district. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the cold, gray Indiana highways. Reaching out to the corporate legal team at Whitmore Commercial HVSC was out of the question. Those attorneys technically collected their salaries from my company, but their daily instructions now came from Caleb. I needed someone whose allegiance was owed entirely to me. I needed a man who had spent decades in the trenches of corporate warfare and had the iron constitution to wage it. I drove 20 miles past the city limits to a rusted neon-lit diner sitting alone on a desolate stretch of highway, the kind of place where road-weary truckers drank burnt coffee and no one looked up from their plates. I came around to the back lot, parked, and pushed inside. The air was heavy with old grease and cheap bacon. In the far corner booth, hands wrapped around a black coffee, sat Bart Keegan. Bart was my former attack dog attorney, a man who had spent over 30 years running legal interference for my company against frivolous suits and hostile takeover attempts before hanging it up for fishing and bourbon. His legal mind was razor sharp, and his moral hesitation when it came to protecting a client was essentially non-existent. I dropped into the cracked vinyl seat across from him. He took one slow sip of his coffee and read my face like a balance sheet. "You look like a man who just watched his own funeral." Bart said, his voice gravelly and low. I laid the whole timeline out for him with surgical precision: the anniversary dinner, the shattered scotch glass, the wild fury in Caleb's eyes when he screamed about his money. I walked him through the performance the next morning, the gift basket, Vanessa's silky lie about setting up a family protection trust to shield me from elder predators. I described the declined card at the mechanic's shop, the terrified voice of my banker, and the gut-punch reality of a court-ordered co-conservatorship. Then I told him about the red light at the executive elevator. I described working my way up to the top floor and finding Vanessa, a woman with no corporate title, no credentials, no standing of any kind, casually putting her signature on commercial real estate transfer deeds, on my company's own letterhead, actively selling off downtown supply warehouses. Bart set his coffee mug down with a deliberate thud. He did not look shocked. He looked like a man doing rapid and dangerous calculations. "A conservatorship," Bart murmured, moving his head slowly from side to side. "That is the absolute nuclear option, Gerald. They did not just put a temporary freeze on your checking accounts. They persuaded a sitting judge that you are severely mentally incapacitated. They have essentially had you legally declared unfit to manage your own daily affairs. Something like that demands extensive, rigorously assembled documentation. They would have needed a licensed physician to file a sworn affidavit attesting to serious cognitive decline. This has been in the works for many months. I need to know exactly how deep this goes," I said, holding my voice steady against the adrenaline hammering in my chest. "I need to know what they have taken, and I need that answer now." Bart did not pause for even his breath. He reached into his worn leather briefcase, produced a battered laptop, and flipped it open directly on the sticky diner table, entirely ignoring the waitress, who appeared to top off his mug. He connected through a secure, encrypted mobile hotspot, and his fingers went to work. The rapid clatter of keys was the only sound between us for several long, agonizing minutes. Bart was not touching any standard search engine. He was drilling straight into buried county public records, and restricted state judicial databases. I watched the glow of the screen reflected in his thick reading glasses. His jaw drew tight. The Family Protection Trust is a real entity, Bart said, eyes moving quickly across the dense legal language scrolling before him. But it is no protective shield, Gerald. They built it as an ironclad, irrevocable trust with Caleb installed as the primary controlling trustee and Vanessa named as secondary. The bulk of your liquid personal assets have already been funneled into it. The fraudulent conservatorship handed them the legal authority to move your money without a single authorizing signature from you. You have been completely locked out of your own life savings. But those commercial real estate transfers you witnessed Vanessa signing, those concern me the most. They are converting your prime commercial properties into untraceable cash as fast as they legally can. Bart went silent again, fingers moving quickly as he shifted his search parameters. He opened a fresh tab and pulled up county property tax assessments and residential deed records. He typed in the address of my sprawling brick estate in Carmel, the home where Loretta and I had raised our family, where I had slept without worry just the night before, the home I had paid off in full 20 years ago. The loading icon turned in a slow, agonizing circle. Then the page filled with a dense block of official text. Bart stopped typing. He drew one slow, heavy breath and lifted his eyes to mine. His expression carried a gravity I had never seen on his face in our entire 30-year relationship. Gerald, he said quietly, and something in the weight of that single word made my stomach drop through the floor. I need you to prepare yourself. He turned the laptop around and pushed it across the table toward me. I looked down at the screen. There in stark official text was the deed to my Carmel estate. My name was gone entirely, listed as sole owners in its place, Caleb and Vanessa Whitmore. The transfer date was printed clearly at the bottom of the document. It had been executed 3 weeks ago. My signature flawlessly forged. My blood went cold. The full shape of my situation locked into place with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. This was not simply about the company or the bank accounts. They had taken the physical ground beneath my feet. If I drove back to that house and confronted them with this betrayal, they would not merely dismiss me. They could call the police and have me dragged off the property as a trespasser in what had been my own home. I walked out of that greasy diner with Bart's warning still echoing in my skull. The night air was bitter, but I registered none of it. My own son had put a forged signature on my name. He had taken the house where his mother had rocked him to sleep as a boy. Going back there now meant walking straight into a legal ambush. Caleb and Vanessa could have me arrested for trespassing. I got back into the old Chevrolet and drove to a modest motel near the county line, settled the bill in cash, and sat on the edge of a lumpy mattress, staring at a blank wall. Panic is the enemy of clear thinking. What I had to do was dismantle Caleb's illusion that he was in total control. To accomplish that, I required proof, hard, undeniable evidence of his corporate theft. Caleb had always looked at me as though I were a relic, a man who didn't grasp modern cloud systems and was therefore blind to the inner workings of his own company. He was confident that his newly installed firewalls and digital access tokens had sealed me out of the accounting infrastructure for good. He had killed my administrator keycard and revoked every remote access credential tied to my name. But Caleb was arrogant, and arrogance breeds catastrophic oversights. He had completely forgotten where this building came from. 20 years ago, I personally directed the installation of the original internal server architecture. Before cloud storage became the industry standard, everything ran through a heavily reinforced physical mainframe buried in the concrete basement of headquarters. When we migrated to newer systems, I insisted that core mainframes stay live and connected to the network as a fail-safe redundancy. I had my engineers build in a hardwired master override terminal completely off the grid, bypassing every external firewall and tied exclusively to my own physical biometrics. No digital password required, just my body, Just me. Frank Cardwell was the man I turned to, a private investigator of exceptional resourcefulness I'd kept on retainer for years. We didn't meet at an office. I found him in an empty grocery store parking lot at the stroke of midnight. There were no emotional confessions about what my son had done to me. I pressed an envelope of cash into his hand, told him what I required: a military-grade encrypted hard drive, the fastest transfer speed money could buy. Cardwell said nothing beyond a single nod. He passed me a heavy black metal casing, climbed back into his car, and disappeared into the dark without one word of curiosity. I sat behind the wheel of my truck, eyes fixed on the dashboard clock as the minutes ground forward. Every light in that building needed to be off. Every member of the late-night cleaning crew needed to be gone. I didn't move until those glowing dashboard digits rolled over to exactly 2 hours in the morning. I shifted into gear and made my way back to the glass and steel fortress I had spent my life constructing. 2 blocks short of the entrance, I pulled into a shadowed alleyway and killed the engine. I turned my heavy wool coat collar up against the night air and moved on foot toward the rear loading docks of the Whitmore headquarters. Caleb had recently thrown hundreds of thousands of dollars at the building's security, high-definition cameras and motion sensors, blanketing every main entrance. But there was one thing he had no knowledge of whatsoever. When this structure first went up, I personally mandated a subterranean service corridor, a tunnel that ran beneath the foundation and tied the primary electrical grid into the municipal storm drain system. Nobody had touched that entrance in years. It sat concealed behind a rusted industrial dumpster, sitting completely out of the sightline of his fancy new cameras. I worked my way behind the steel bin and located the old iron grate set into the ground. A heavy crowbar came out from under my coat. I drove it beneath the iron lip and heaved with everything my 70-year-old arms still had in them. The grate screamed against the concrete and gave way. I lowered myself into the damp and lightless tunnel below. A small tactical flashlight lit the path ahead as I pressed through the narrow passage, my boots finding shallow puddles with every step. At the far end stood the heavy reinforced steel door, the building's true hidden entrance, engineered long before electronic keypads were ever a consideration. From my coat pocket, I produced a heavy brass skeleton key, one I'd been carrying for 2 solid decades, and eased it into the mechanical lock. Every tumbler fell into alignment. The door swung open. I moved quietly into the sub-basement of the Whitmore headquarters. Cold, dry, heavily filtered air met me at the threshold. The cavernous hum of industrial cooling fans pressed against the concrete walls from every direction. I made my way through the dim corridors, passing row after row of massive electrical panels without breaking stride. My destination was the central server room, a standalone concrete bunker sealed behind a thick security door with its own dedicated access system. I stepped up to the access panel. It was an older unit, one that Caleb's wave of technological upgrades had never reached. I laid my right hand flat against the glass scanning surface. A narrow red beam swept the full width of my palm, reading the ridgeline map of my fingerprints. The machine emitted a low processing hum. Then a compact digital lens pushed out from the wall panel. I brought my face close, lining up my right eye with the glowing green targeting reticle. The scanner fired a sharp beam of light punched straight into my pupil. It was charting the intricate vascular network of my retina, checking those biological signatures against the foundational code buried inside the master override protocol. 3 agonizing seconds passed. The terminal gave back nothing. My heart slammed against the inside of my chest. If someone had quietly decommissioned this system without my knowledge, the silent alarms would go off at once, and I'd be standing in this basement waiting for police to walk in and charge me with corporate espionage inside my own building. Then the thick steel door released a loud, resonant electronic clack. Green light washed across the access panel. The deadbolts drew back smoothly into the surrounding walls. I seized the handle and hauled the door open. The server room swallowed me in a wave of freezing air. Towering black server racks lined the space in long rows like motionless guards, their faces alive with thousands of blinking blue and green indicator lights. The cooling units roared. To anyone else, it would have been unbearable noise. To me, standing in that room, it was the sound of victory. I crossed to the console at the room's center, flipped back the cover on the master override port, and laid bare the raw physical connection running directly into the corporate network. I unzipped my coat and withdrew the military-grade encrypted hard drive Cardwell had handed me. I seated the thick cable firmly into the mainframe terminal. A command prompt snapped to life on the dusty monitor. The system recognized my biometric credentials without hesitation. I was fully in. My fingers ran through a rapid sequence of legacy command codes, cutting straight past Caleb's modern accounting software and dropping into the raw, unfiltered root directories beneath it. I zeroed in on the hidden financial folders, the files Caleb had buried deep and fully expected never to be found. I hit execute. The progress bar lit up the screen. There I stood alone in the frozen basement, watching the percentage figures inch upward as 12 months of Caleb's secret shadow accounting transferred onto the drive. That blue bar crawled across the monitor at a glacial pace. My breath came out in faint white wisps in the heavily filtered sub-basement air. The military-grade hard drive hummed steadily beside me, pulling in enormous blocks of compressed financial data. A full transfer would require at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes is an eternity when you are the one doing the infiltrating, standing inside your own company headquarters at the dead of night. To keep myself from coming apart at the seams, I pulled open a secondary window on the terminal. I worked around the main directory and pulled directly into the raw data packets moving through the network bridge. I needed to know with my own eyes what Caleb had been concealing behind those fabricated firewalls. The master ledger for the third quarter came up immediately. The spreadsheet expanded across the screen, thousands of line items stacking up in neat columns. Taken at face value, it looked immaculate. Payroll figures were in order. Supplier invoices tracked perfectly against the quarterly projections. Distribution center overhead sat right where historical averages said it should. Caleb had brought in someone genuinely talented to construct this fiction. But I didn't build a $40 million enterprise by accepting what the surface showed me. The rhythm of this company lived inside me. I understood it more intimately than my own pulse. I pulled out the outgoing vendor payments and sorted them by origination date with one specific target in mind, the month Caleb formally took the chief executive chair. The picture beneath the surface revealed itself almost at once. Tucked under the enormous legitimate line items for industrial copper piping and commercial-grade refrigerants, something was quietly bleeding out. A wire transfer, recurring weekly disciplined, flowing out to an entity called Apex Logistics Solutions. The invoices described it as expedited supply chain management fees, billed at $45,000 every single week. I cross-referenced our approved vendor database. The name Apex Logistics Solutions appeared nowhere in our records prior to last November. I pushed further, running a direct search through the state corporate registry using the raw command terminal. Apex Logistics Solutions was a limited liability company. Its address nothing but a generic post office box in Wyoming. The managing director on record was a corporate proxy firm, a shell company, clean classic textbook. My own son was draining Whitmore Commercial HVAC of its lifeblood. My fingers hit the keyboard harder, driving through folder after folder with cold, mechanical determination. But Apex was nowhere near the end of it. 5 more ghost entities materialized as I dug. Horizon Strategic Ventures, Summit Global Purchasing, Pinnacle Consulting Partners. Each one a hollow fabrication, each one quietly pulling hundreds of thousands of dollars out of our operating capital, dressed up as administrative services and consulting work that never existed. Across 12 months, Caleb had walked away with nearly $4 million stripped directly from the primary operational accounts. The number was breathtaking, but when I pressed into the balance sheets, something far worse stopped me cold. $4 million was a serious wound, no question. But Whitmore Commercial HVAC brought in $40 million in annual revenue. That level of loss would damage the profit margins. It would not bring the entire structure down. Yet the internal cash flow readings were screaming in red. The company was in a severe liquidity crisis. Holding my breath, I tunneled deeper into the central collateral registries while the encrypted files continued decrypting onto the screen. What surfaced next made that $4 million look like a rounding error on a petty cash receipt. Caleb wasn't just skimming money to sustain his lifestyle. He had turned the entire corporate entity into a financial weapon against me. I opened a directory buried so far down it was practically invisible, labeled offshore liabilities. My son had taken the tangible backbone of Whitmore Commercial HVAC, the heavy machinery, the distribution warehouses, the fleet of 280 service trucks, and pledged every last piece of it as collateral against massive, highly leveraged offshore margin accounts. He was pulling tens of millions of dollars from unregulated international lenders, and the guarantee behind every single one of those loans was the company I had given my life to build. That borrowed capital was being poured straight into high-risk foreign exchange markets, and aggressive short-term investment plays the most volatile financial terrain imaginable. My son was spinning the wheel of financial roulette, wagering the very foundation of everything I had given my life to construct. If those offshore margin calls collapsed, the international lenders held full legal authority to seize every asset bearing the Whitmore name. The warehouses would go. The trucks would go. They would strip the tools directly from the hands of my workers. Caleb had essentially wired a catastrophic financial bomb into the core of the company and set the clock running. My chest closed in on itself with a suffocating, blinding rage. I grabbed the edge of the metal server rack, knuckles draining white. This was the same man who had locked eyes with me across that high-end steakhouse table, slammed his crystal glass down, and screamed accusations about me squandering his inheritance. He had been projecting his own catastrophic financial destruction onto me the entire time. He required the Family Protection Trust to absorb my personal wealth because he had already hollowed out the corporate wealth. On the monitor, the progress bar reached 100%. A green confirmation box appeared on the screen. The massive transfer was complete and successful. I pulled the military-grade hard drive from the port and tucked it into the deep interior pocket of my heavy winter wool coat. I shut down the raw command terminal, scrubbing my digital footprint from the master override registry so that Caleb's technology team would find no trace of my presence. I sealed the access port and stepped back into the dark, freezing concrete corridor of the sub-basement. The heavy security door swung shut at my back, the massive internal deadbolts re-engaging with a deep, resonant thud. The raw financial data was now in my possession. I had undeniable proof offshore financial fraud laid bare, and the reckless collateralization of my life's entire body of work documented in full. I could walk that encrypted hard drive into federal offices come morning and watch my son be let out of his own building in steel handcuffs. But raw financial data by itself was not enough. The accounting ledgers proved how the corporate theft had been engineered, but they revealed nothing about the tactical strategy in play. Caleb and Vanessa had already pulled off a fraudulent medical conservatorship, stripping away my legal rights and seizing my home. They clearly had a specific, precisely coordinated physical plan to remove me from the picture on a permanent basis. I had to know exactly when they planned to bring that plan down on top of me. I needed their timeline before they could blindside me again with another legal or medical strike I never saw coming. Walking out of this building tonight and waiting passively for the trap to close around me was not an option. I needed ears working inside that executive suite. I needed to hear every word exchanged in the private, undisturbed quiet of that enormous corner office. I pressed the hard drive deeper into my coat and turned away from the glowing server banks. The sub-basement sat in eerie silence as I retraced my path through those dim corridors. The financial data was secured, but data was nothing more than a record of what Caleb had already taken. What I needed now was forward intelligence. I needed the tactical blueprint of their next strike against me. To obtain that, I had to climb into the belly of the beast. I bypassed the main service elevator. Its digital tracking log would capture any movement, override command or not. I moved instead toward the central concrete stairwell. The heavy steel fire door let out a low groan as I pulled it open. I started up the long, punishing climb toward the top floor of the corporate headquarters. Every floor burned in my 70-year-old lungs, but the cold fury running through me drove each step upward. I pushed past the manufacturing levels, the logistics departments, the human resources floors. Each one was a chapter of my own life, staring back at me, a piece of the empire assembled by my hands through decades of relentless sacrifice. Now every inch of it was occupied by a son who treated my legacy like a personal expense account. I arrived at the heavy fire doors of the executive level. The corridor beyond was pitch black. Nothing but the faint ambient wash of emergency exit signs along the walls. The thick plush carpet swallowed every sound my heavy winter boots made as I moved down the hall without a whisper. I passed the boardroom, past the senior vice president's suites, my gaze locked on the massive double doors at the far end. Caleb's corner office, the nerve center of his fraudulent operation. The door was secured with a modern biometric deadbolt, a costly security measure he had installed the moment he claimed my position as chief executive officer. He had convinced himself that modern technology made him untouchable. What he failed to remember was that I was the man who oversaw the installation of the very doors he now hid behind. From my pocket, I retrieved a small, specialized magnetic bypass key. Frank Cardwell had put it in my hands weeks earlier when my suspicions first hardened into certainty. I slid the thin, magnetized strip into the narrow gap between the digital strike plate and the doorframe. I worked it with careful, deliberate pressure until I caught the faint, unmistakable click of the mechanical tumbler releasing. The heavy wooden door moved inward on silent hinges. I stepped inside the vast executive suite and eased the door shut behind me. The room was lit only by the pale, cold glow of winter moonlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sheer opulence of the space turned my stomach. Caleb had gutted my old office entirely. The practical oak desk I had worked behind for years was gone, replaced by a slab of imported Italian marble the size of a small boat. He had put in a private wet bar, the shelves lined with crystal decanters and Scotch bottles that cost more than my first service van. He was living like a billionaire king, balanced on the very edge of a financial cliff. I crossed the room deliberately and positioned myself directly behind that marble desk. From the inner lining of my coat, I drew out a small, sealed plastic envelope. Inside was a piece of military-grade surveillance equipment Frank Cardwell had sourced for me, a micro-audio transmitter no larger than a standard coin cell battery fitted with an omnidirectional condenser microphone capable of capturing a whisper from 30 feet away. Extraordinarily powerful, but with one critical weakness. It depended on a continuous power supply to hold an active transmission beyond 48 hours. I couldn't afford to have the battery go silent before Caleb and Vanessa disclosed their final plan against me. I needed a permanent power source. My gaze dropped to the right corner of the marble desk. Sitting there was a heavy, custom-crafted brass reading lamp. Something sharp and unexpected gripped my chest, a pang of sorrow I hadn't anticipated. I had commissioned that lamp personally from a local artisan, presented it to Caleb the day I formally elevated him to chief executive officer. It was meant to symbolize the transfer of responsibility, a light to steady him through the hardest decisions of leadership. Now that same gift, chosen with pride and with love, was going to become the instrument of his complete undoing. I took a small multi-tool from my pocket and extended the precision screwdriver. I laid the heavy brass lamp carefully on its side across the smooth marble surface, protecting the polished stone from any scratch. I peeled the felt pad from the base and worked the screws out of the base plate one by one. They gave way without resistance under steady, deliberate turns. I lifted the base plate free, exposing the lamp's internal wiring. The thick copper power cord ran in a clean splice directly into the main rotary switch. Wire strippers came out next. I peeled back a 1/4 inch of black rubber insulation and exposed the live wires beneath. My hands did not shake. The adrenaline sharpened everything: my eyes, my focus, my fingers, reducing the entire world to the precise mechanical task directly in front of me. I took the micro-audio transmitter and examined the two slender power leads extending from its casing. With meticulous care, I wound those fragile leads around the exposed copper wires of the desk lamp. From my pocket came a small roll of black electrical tape. I wrapped each spliced connection tightly and thoroughly, eliminating any possibility of a short circuit. As long as that lamp stayed plugged into the wall, the surveillance device would draw a silent, continuous, completely undetectable trickle of current. The microphone sat flush against the hollow ventilation gap near the base of the brass casing, invisible, perfectly integrated. I set the base plate back into position and walked the tiny screws back into their original threading with the same steady hands that had once built this company from nothing. Before I tell you what I uncovered that night and what it revealed about just how far my own son was willing to go, let me ask you this: if someone you loved and trusted turned out to be working against you in the dark, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you go quiet and build your case in silence? I drove each screw back home with steady, deliberate turns and pressed the protective felt pad firmly into place. I stood the lamp upright and set it back in its precise original position at the right corner of the marble desk. A soft microfiber cloth came out of my pocket next, and I worked it carefully across the brass casing, the marble surface, and the desk edges, removing every trace of my fingerprints and my presence. The office looked as though no one had touched it. The expensive Scotch bottles stood in their places undisturbed. The leather chairs sat in perfect alignment. Caleb would step into this room in a matter of hours with no earthly idea that his own father had wired his inner sanctum into a live broadcasting station. I turned away from the executive seat and slipped back into the darkened hallway without a sound. I retraced my route at a controlled pace down the central stairwell, back into the freezing concrete sub-basement, through the maintenance tunnel, and out behind the rusted industrial dumpster. The winter wind cut hard across my face as I moved quickly through the dark alleyways toward my vintage pickup truck. I got in and pulled the heavy metal doors shut. My chest was heaving, my muscles burning from the physical and emotional weight of what I had just done. But rest was not something I could afford. I reached into the glove compartment and drew out the small black receiver unit Frank Cardwell had paired with the transmitter. I plugged the molded earpiece into the jack and seated it in my right ear. I flipped the power switch on the side of the unit. The small digital screen lit up bright red, strong, active connection. A soft, crystal-clear hiss of static settled into my ear. I reached over and nudged the volume dial. Through the earpiece came the distant hum of the building's massive heating system, bleeding through the microphone. I could pick up the subtle shift of air pressure inside the corner office. The audio feed was flawless. I leaned back into the worn leather seat of my truck and stared through the frost-covered windshield at the towering glass headquarters across the street. The dashboard clock read 3:30 in the morning. The financial data was secured. The live surveillance feed was live. The trap had been set. Now there was nothing left to do but sit in the freezing dark and wait for them to talk. For 3 punishing days, the cab of my vintage Chevrolet pickup truck became my entire world. I kept the truck tucked in the far corner of a busy coffee shop parking lot, hidden in plain sight among the daily rotation of morning commuters and delivery vans. The position gave me a clean, unobstructed line of sight to the Whitmore commercial headquarters just down the street. The weather turned savage. A relentless, freezing sleet hammered the windshield, coating the glass in a thick gray shell of ice. I ran the engine in short intervals to keep the heater from giving out, entirely surviving on bitter black coffee and stale granola bars. My entire existence narrowed to the soft, continuous hiss of static pushing through the molded plastic earpiece lodged in my right ear. I was a ghost, haunting the outer edge of my own stolen empire. The micro-audio transmitter wired into Caleb's brass reading lamp performed with terrifying precision. The sensitivity of that microphone was something to behold. I could make out the faint scratch of his expensive fountain pen moving across paper. I could hear the subtle creak of his leather executive chair shifting beneath him. I heard every routine corporate exchange, the supply chain grievances, the standard vendor negotiations, the mundane daily business of running a company. Listening to my son perform the role of visionary chief executive turned my gut with a nauseating mixture of deep sorrow and building fury. He sounded so certain of himself, projecting the air of a self-made man, as though he had forgotten entirely that every floorboard beneath his feet had been laid by my hands. But I did not let that fury break my concentration for a single moment. Patience is the sharpest weapon a seasoned hunter carries. I knew they would eventually drop their guard. I knew the silence would crack. On the afternoon of the third day, the sleet gave way to a heavy, blinding snowstorm. The sky above Indianapolis darkened well before its time, draping the whole industrial district in a grim and suffocating shadow. The coffee shop lot began draining of cars as people rushed to beat the worsening road conditions. I didn't move. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, hands resting heavy on the cold steering wheel. I turned up the volume dial on the black receiver sitting on the passenger seat, pushing the audio feed louder to cut through the steady beating of the truck's windshield wipers against the glass. Caleb was finishing up a phone call with a regional logistics manager debating delays in commercial freight. His tone was dismissive and impatient, a man who had never earned the loyalty he expected from the people beneath him. I shook my head in the dark cab. He never grasped the first thing about respect. When the call clicked off, a brief and heavy silence settled over the executive corner office. Then came the unmistakable sound of the heavy wooden door swinging open. The biometric deadbolt clicked an authorized entry. The sharp, rapid percussion of high heels crossed the imported marble floor. That stride, aggressive, purposeful, unhurried, I knew it without a moment's doubt. Vanessa had arrived. The shift in that room's atmosphere registered through the tiny earpiece like a change in barometric pressure. Caleb exhaled a long, heavy sigh, the manufactured boardroom confidence bleeding right out of his voice. Vanessa offered no greeting. She didn't ask how his day had gone. The clicking of her heels stopped directly in front of the marble desk. "Did the medical certificate completely clear through the county clerk yet?" Vanessa asked. Her voice was razor-edged, soaked in a toxic, barely contained impatience that cut clean through the faint static of the feed. "I swear to God, if there is a single delay in the judicial processing, I am going to lose my mind. That hack psychiatrist charged us $50,000 in untraceable cash just to backdate the evaluation paperwork. He guaranteed the expedited filing. If we do not have the certified judicial stamp by tomorrow morning, I am personally going to his private clinic and demanding a full refund." I sat motionless in the cab. The bitter cold seeping up through the floorboards suddenly meant nothing against the absolute ice flooding my veins. $50,000 in cash. A hired psychiatrist with backdated evaluation paperwork. My mind tore through the pieces of their conversation, assembling the shape of what they had done. I locked both hands around the steering wheel, my knuckles pulling white against the worn leather. This was not a family trust manipulation. This was a criminal conspiracy, methodical, deliberate, and vicious. They had gone out and purchased a fraudulent medical diagnosis from a corrupt physician to build a scientific case for my mental incompetence. Caleb let out a low, dark laugh. There was nothing human in it, no warmth, no trace of the boy I had raised. It was the sound of pure greed congratulating itself. "Relax," Caleb replied, his voice saturated with arrogant, settled satisfaction. "You worry entirely too much." The cash payment completely secured his total cooperation. The doctor was incredibly thorough. He fabricated a comprehensive 3-year medical history, detailing a rapid, aggressive cognitive decline. He falsified the clinical observation records, the mandatory memory test results, and the sworn neurological affidavit. The paperwork was absolutely bulletproof. I spoke directly with our lead litigation attorney 20 minutes ago. It is done. The presiding probate judge officially signed off on the Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis this morning. The emergency hold has been permanently legally validated. The permanent conservatorship is officially ours. Those words arrived like a fist driven straight into my sternum. Stage 2, Alzheimer's disease. The full, breathtaking malice of their design finally stood before me in complete daylight. They had not simply frozen my accounts to stop me from writing checks. They had convinced the entire machinery of the judicial system that my mind was gone. They had built a fabricated, clinically detailed medical history, proving I was in the grip of a progressive, incurable neurological disease. By purchasing that permanent diagnosis, they had legally erased me as a functioning human being. I stared through the frost-covered windshield, seeing nothing. The snow was falling heavy now, burying Indianapolis under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. I was a sharp, completely healthy 70-year-old man who had constructed a corporate empire from bare ground. But inside the legal system, I had just been officially declared a hollow, pitiable shell entirely at the mercy of a son who held nothing but contempt for me. The weight of it settled into my bones like cold iron. They were not simply raiding my finances to fund their shallow, glittering lifestyle. They were dismantling my very legal existence. They had sealed me inside a permanent medical cage from which there was no recognized avenue of escape. Once they delivered me to some underfunded dementia ward, not a soul in the world would take my word for anything. Every cry for help would be written off as the confused ramblings of an old man with a broken mind. They had purchased a counterfeit medical diagnosis to strip away my legal standing as a human being. The permanent conservatorship was theirs. The snow kept falling without mercy, burying the windshield under a thick, suffocating shell of white ice. I sat motionless in the freezing, dark breath-shallow hands resting on the wheel. The small black receiver unit on the passenger seat pushed its faint, continuous hum through the molded earpiece lodged in my right ear. The live audio feed from my former executive office remained flawlessly crisp. And then the silence in that corner office fractured, and what came through the earpiece dragged me into a darkness I was not prepared for. I caught the heavy thud of the wooden door being pushed open. The aggressive percussion of high heels struck the imported marble floor in sharp, rapid beats. Vanessa walked in. Her voice arrived like a blade through the static, razor-edged, coiled with impatient fury. "Did the medical certificate clear?" she demanded. "That hack psychiatrist charged us $50,000 in cash to backdate the paperwork. I swear to God, if there is a single delay in the judicial processing, I am going to lose my mind." I sat locked in place behind that wheel. The cold bleeding through the floorboards was nothing now against the ice spreading through my chest. $50,000 in untraceable cash. A corrupt psychiatrist with manufactured backdated evaluation paperwork. The fragments of their exchange assembled themselves in my mind into something monstrous. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white against the worn leather. They had engineered a criminal medical conspiracy, calculated, deliberate, and utterly without conscience. Caleb let out a low, dark laugh. There was nothing of a son in that sound. No warmth, no trace of loyalty or humanity. "It is done," Caleb answered, his voice heavy with arrogant, settled satisfaction. "The court officially signed off on the Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. The permanent conservatorship is ours." Those words struck me like a physical blow directly to the sternum. Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease. The full architecture of their malice finally stood before me without cover. This was not simply a matter of frozen accounts and blocked charitable donations. They had marched into a courtroom and persuaded the entire judicial apparatus that my mind was irreparably gone. They had constructed a fabricated, clinically detailed medical record, a documented history of rapid, irreversible neurological deterioration. By purchasing that specific permanent diagnosis, they had effectively erased me as a legal person. The pacing footsteps stopped. I heard the faint clink of crystal against marble. Caleb was pouring himself a celebratory drink, toasting his impending triumph over the man who had handed him everything he had. "The final logistical phase is completely mapped out and firmly secured," Caleb said. The ambulance is officially scheduled for next Friday at 9 in the morning. They will pick the old man up and take him directly to the lockdown dementia ward at Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek. That name hit me like a cold fist to the throat. It was a notoriously grim, severely underfunded state facility buried deep in the forgotten industrial fringe of the neighboring county. An overcrowded, bleak concrete fortress built for the completely abandoned and the utterly destitute, a place where wards of the state were kept heavily sedated and locked behind reinforced steel doors and frosted safety glass. Through the earpiece, I heard Vanessa release a sharp, genuine laugh. It was glittering and vicious, bouncing off the walls of that cavernous suite. Hollow Creek, Vanessa repeated, her voice soaked in amusement and absolute malice. That is absolutely brilliant, my Caleb. Once he is secured inside the memory ward, nobody will believe a single word he says. If he tries to report us for corporate embezzlement, the underpaid nursing staff will sedate him and document it as a severe paranoid delusion. He will be entirely neutralized. The physical extraction on Friday morning is merely the final operational cleanup. Caleb continued, his tone smooth and unhurried. We wire the $12 million in cash to the hidden Cayman accounts on Thursday night and file for corporate bankruptcy on Monday. The entire commercial entity will collapse under the weight of the highly leveraged offshore margin debt. We will publicly claim that the old man severely mismanaged the corporate supply chain during his rapid cognitive decline. I pressed my eyes shut against the wave of blind panic. The breathtaking cruelty of what they had designed was almost too large to hold in my mind at once. They were going to weaponize the terror of cognitive decline to execute a flawless financial demolition. They would chemically restrain my mind and bury my voice under layers of state bureaucracy. And if I fought back during the extraction, if I screamed, if I demanded a lawyer, it would only feed the fraudulent narrative. The transport team would read my righteous fury as dementia-driven aggression. I would be physically restrained, strapped to a gurney, and injected with sedatives before the walls of that state facility ever came into view. I reached up with a cold, trembling hand and drew the earpiece slowly from my right ear. The static dissolved instantly into the howl of winter wind battering the frozen panels of the truck. The timeline was no longer a threat waiting to materialize. It was locked and running. Next Friday at exactly 9 in the morning, a private ambulance would pull up to my front door and haul me away to a fortified dementia ward. Thursday night, they would wire $12 million to the untraceable Cayman Islands. Monday morning, they would reduce the $40 million corporate empire I had spent my entire adult life constructing to rubble. They had built a perfectly synchronized, deeply evil plan to seize my wealth, obliterate my legacy, and extinguish my legal existence entirely. But they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They were certain I was home asleep, blissfully unaware of the blade descending toward my neck. They had no idea the military-grade encrypted hard drive was sitting in my coat pocket. They had no idea I had captured every damning word of their conspiracy on tape. I turned the ignition, and the engine thundered to life. I drove the transmission into gear with purpose. The time for sitting in the shadows and listening was finished. I pulled away from the curb tires, pressing through the fresh snow blanketing the dark street. The blizzard was worsening, but the road conditions were irrelevant to me now. My mind was locked onto a single point, the timeline ticking down inside my head. I didn't go back to the motel. I drove straight through the howling storm toward the affluent suburbs of Zionsville, headed directly for Bart Keegan's private residence. It was 4 in the morning when I turned into his winding, tree-lined driveway. I walked to the heavy oak front door and hammered my frozen fist against it until the porch light came on. Bart answered, wearing a thick robe, eyes narrowed against the light. But the instant he registered the look on my face, that dead cold, absolute look, he didn't ask a single question. He simply stepped back and waved me into his warm, dimly lit home office. I dropped into a leather wingback chair. I set the military-grade encrypted hard drive on his mahogany desk. Then I unclipped the black audio receiver from my belt, placed it beside the drive, and pressed play. Bart stood with his arms folded across his chest, while the crystal-clear recording filled the room. He listened to Vanessa raging about the $50,000 paid to a corrupt psychiatrist in untraceable cash. He listened to Caleb confirming the stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis with quiet satisfaction. He listened to my own son walk through the plan, the ambulance arriving Friday morning, the dementia ward at Hollow Creek, the Thursday wire transfer of $12 million to the Cayman Islands, the Monday morning bankruptcy filing that would finish off everything I had built. When the recording finally clicked off, the silence that filled that room had genuine weight to it. Bart walked slowly to the desk, picked up the encrypted hard drive, and plugged it into his secure forensic computer. He didn't reach for empty reassurances or hollow words of comfort. He understood that wasn't what I needed. What I needed was a battle plan. Bart launched a battery of complex data decryption tools, his eyes moving rapidly across the raw financial ledgers I had pulled from the subterranean corporate mainframe. For nearly an hour, the only sounds in that office were the howling wind pushing against the window and the steady, rapid rhythm of Bart's keyboard. He was methodically tracing the origin points of the massive offshore margin accounts Caleb had established. He followed the digital thread connecting the 6 fabricated shell companies running their outgoing wire transfers against international banking registries. Then Bart stopped typing altogether. He leaned in close to the monitor, parsing a deeply buried chain of transactional codes. He pulled off his reading glasses and pressed his fingers hard against his eyes with a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. "Gerald." "Bart," said his voice, stripped of every trace of its usual confident sharpness. "This is dramatically worse than straightforward corporate embezzlement. Caleb has not simply been skimming your operating capital to finance an extravagant lifestyle. He has been systematically liquidating the entire corporate infrastructure to cover catastrophic, wildly reckless investment losses." I fixed my eyes on him and demanded he lay it out completely. Bart turned the monitor toward me. He opened a buried directory linking the offshore margin accounts to a largely unregulated black market cryptocurrency exchange operating out of Eastern Europe. Caleb had been aggressively day trading volatile digital assets using extreme illegal institutional leverage. He had used the pristine credit rating of Whitmore Commercial HVAC to borrow tens of millions of dollars from shadow lenders, pouring every last cent into highly speculative crypto markets. The digital ledgers painted the portrait of a desperate man chasing his own destruction. Caleb had lost a staggering $20 million across the previous 8 months. The margin calls were coming due, and the offshore lenders were pressing hard for repayment. The corporate cash reserves were entirely gone. He had leveraged the warehouses, the service trucks, and the heavy machinery to the outermost legal limit. The $12 million they were planning to wire to the Cayman Islands on Thursday night was not any kind of strategic corporate maneuver. It was the final remaining fragment of liquid cash the company still possessed. A getaway fund deliberately untraceable. They were draining the last drops of life from the enterprise, readying themselves to abandon the hollowed-out shell before the offshore margin debt triggered a catastrophic default. I stared at the glowing monitor, struggling to absorb the full scale of his failure. My son was not some cunning criminal architect. He was a frightened, pathetic gambler who had reduced a $40 million commercial enterprise to rubble, trying to conceal his own spectacular incompetence. He had incinerated my life's work because his pride would not allow him to admit he was losing. But the financial wreckage was only part of the horror. Bart rose from his leather chair and began moving across the woven rug, his sharp legal mind working to connect the final and deadliest threads of this conspiracy. He stopped and turned to face me directly, a grim and devastating realization settling into his features. "So, Gerald, you need to understand the full weight of the federal landscape right now," Bart said, his voice dropping to a hard, urgent murmur. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission are actively pursuing these exact offshore crypto platforms on charges of massive institutional money laundering and serious wire fraud. Federal task forces are already tracking the precise digital transaction routes Caleb has been running. It is only a matter of time before those authorities trace the source of those illegal margin accounts directly back to the physical servers at Whitmore Commercial. The true malice buried inside their Friday morning schedule suddenly snapped into focus with a sickening, blinding clarity. Caleb was not merely stealing my final $12 million. He was deliberately engineering a frame to pin one of the largest corporate wire fraud cases in the history of this state on me. Bart pressed his hands flat on the heavy mahogany desk and leaned in close. "Do you see the whole board now, Gerald?" he asked, his voice grave. "On Thursday night, they wire the $12 million to the Cayman Islands and vanish without a trace. On Friday morning, you are sedated and permanently committed to the dementia ward at Hollow Creek. On Monday, the corporate bankruptcy triggers the catastrophic default. When the federal agents finally descend on the headquarters, Caleb and Vanessa are already gone. Your forged signature sits on every illegal offshore transfer document. You will be the sole corporate owner on record locked inside an underfunded state institution, declared legally incompetent. They are leaving you behind to absorb the entire federal fallout for massive wire fraud. They were not simply taking my money anymore. They were sealing me inside a concrete cage from which no voice could reach the outside world." I sat across the mahogany desk from Bart Keegan and let the full weight of what he had just said press down on me. Caleb had engineered the ultimate scapegoat. He had used my life's work as a gambling stake in the volatile corners of the global digital economy. He had lost $20 million on illegal margin trades and gutted Whitmore Commercial in the process. Now he intended to disappear with the remaining $12 million, leaving me stranded in a psychiatric ward to absorb every consequence of the federal investigation bearing down on them. The federal task forces were already closing in. When those offshore exchanges collapsed, investigators would follow the wire fraud straight to my forged signature. I would spend whatever days remained to me inside a federal penitentiary, stripped of any credible voice to mount a defense. "We need to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately," Bart said, the urgency alive in every word. "We have to place this hard drive before the attorney, before Caleb initiates that final wire transfer. If we act now, a federal injunction can freeze every corporate account." I shook my head. A cold, hard focus had moved in over the panic. "We cannot go to the federal authorities yet, Bart," I replied, keeping my voice steady and level. "If the government steps in and freezes the corporate assets right now, that remaining $12 million sits locked in judicial limbo for the next decade. The operational accounts get seized as evidence in a wire fraud investigation. The company defaults on payroll. My employees, the men and women who built this alongside me, lose their jobs, their health coverage, their livelihoods before Friday afternoon is out. The commercial empire I built from nothing dies on a federal autopsy table. I will not let my workforce pay for my son's greed. I have to get that money out before the authorities know it exists." Bart leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. He studied me with open skepticism. "Gerald," he countered, measured and precise, "Caleb holds the legal authority of the chief executive officer. He has further insulated his position with a conservatorship that declares you mentally incompetent. You have no legal standing to move a single dollar of that remaining $12 million. Any move to intercept that wire transfer will trigger internal banking alarms, and the fraud department will defer to the legally recognized chief executive. Caleb holds every administrative key." I exhaled slowly and leaned forward, forearms resting on the mahogany surface. "Caleb holds the administrative keys," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "But he does not hold the foundational keys. He believes corporate authority flows entirely from his current executive title. He has forgotten who wrote the original corporate bylaws 28 years ago. I need you to pull up the original corporate charter we drafted when Whitmore Commercial first incorporated. Navigate to Section 7, Paragraph 4. Bart frowned, uncertain where I was pointing him. He turned back to his computer, and his fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, pulling up the archived foundational documents of the company. He opened the original charter from 3 decades prior and scrolled steadily through the pages. His eyes tracked the legal language line by line, then the scrolling stopped. A sharp intake of breath escaped him. He removed his glasses and stared at this monitor, genuinely stunned. The poison pill. Bart whispered, his voice barely holding. I completely forgot we embedded this mechanism into the foundational frameworks. When I built this company, I was a careful man. I had seen enough of the corporate world to distrust it completely. I wanted an ironclad guarantee that no rogue executive, no matter who they were, could dismantle what I had constructed. I had instructed Bart to bury an obscure clause deep in the foundational DNA of the corporation. The ultimate failsafe. The clause established that if the sitting chief executive officer was found to be defrauding the corporate entity, the founder held the unilateral legal right to revoke all executive powers and seize full control of all liquid assets, with no board vote required. It bypassed every layer of standard corporate governance. It was a legal guillotine engineered to take a rogue executive's head clean off. But Gerald, Bart stammered, his hands adjusting his glasses with urgent, nervous energy. This clause requires undeniable proof of corporate fraud before the executive override can be triggered. You cannot activate this mechanism on the strength of suspicion alone. Pull this trigger without airtight proof, and the banks come down hard, penalties stacked against the corporation, the transfer locked cold. I drove my index finger down onto the encrypted hard drive. The complete shadow ledger is on here, I told him. $4 million in corporate embezzlement documented in full. I've got the illegal offshore margin account paperwork, showing he pledged the company's physical assets as collateral, no board vote, no authorization, nothing. And I've got him on a crystal-clear audio recording, his own voice confessing that he bought a fraudulent medical diagnosis specifically to strip away my human rights by force. This isn't just irrefutable proof, Bart. What I'm sitting on is an absolute avalanche of incriminating evidence. Get the formal declaration of executive revocation drafted immediately. Set up the legal execution of the poison pill protocol, every line formatted exactly right. The next 48 hours belonged entirely to Bart and me, sealed inside his isolated home office, working in complete secrecy. Every fraudulent digital transaction got cross-referenced against the precise language of the poison pill clause. The legal paperwork built line by careful line. We compiled a massive encrypted packet, the ironclad proof of Caleb's offshore wire fraud, the illegal embezzlement he'd run through the corporation, and that audio recording of the entire Hollow Creek medical conspiracy. The exact digital routing numbers for a secure secondary holding account. One Caleb had never laid eyes on were mapped out and locked in. We were loading the weapon that would detonate his entire financial world. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Food wasn't much better. Black coffee and the raw, desperate adrenaline of a father with nothing left to lose, that's what kept me upright. Hour after grinding hour dissolved into legal strategy and digital preparation, the kind of focused, merciless work that only a cornered man can produce. Outside, the bitter winter storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky that was gray and frozen and utterly indifferent. Then, at last, Thursday night came. The darkness that fell over that quiet suburban street carried something with it, a pressure thick and almost physical, like the air before a detonation. Come early morning at exactly 9 noon, Caleb's armed medical crew would be at my front door. Fake psychiatric warrant in hand, powerful sedative ready to go, fully intending to haul me out of my own stolen home and bury me in a dementia ward no one would ever think to look in. And tonight, the stroke of midnight was Caleb's signal. $12 million drained from the corporate accounts, wired silently to his untraceable Cayman Islands refuge, leaving me standing in the wreckage when federal investigators came knocking. I sat motionless in the low light of Bart Keegan's home office, eyes locked onto the luminous screen of my encrypted laptop. Bottom corner of the monitor, 11:55. 5 minutes before Caleb triggered the offshore wire transfer. 5 minutes before he tried to land the final devastating blow of his plan. Bart hadn't moved from his spot directly behind my chair, breathing slow and shallow, both hands laid across the top of the leather backrest. Every execution protocol loaded and ready. the evidence packets encrypted armed set to distribute automatically on command. I let my fingers come to rest on the keyboard without pressing anything. The moment had arrived. One keystroke brought the decryption software fully to life, 48 hours of meticulous, exhausting preparation, now condensed into a single command. The clock ticked to 11:56. Outside, the winter wind threw itself against the glass of Bart Keegan's office window with everything it had. Inside, the silence was total and crushing, the kind that presses against your eardrums. I pulled in a long, measured breath and let the weight of 3 decades settle squarely across my back. What I was about to do was dismantle piece by piece the very empire I'd bled to build across my entire adult life. But there was no malice driving my hands. This was surgery, brutal and necessary, the only way to preserve whatever life still remained in Whitmore Commercial HVAC. Bart stood unmoving at my shoulder, a quiet and immovable anchor, his authority lending the whole thing its legal spine. He had written those foundational clauses himself nearly 30 years back. He understood the uncompromising, legendary power of the poison pill at a level no one else could, because he had architected it from scratch, with the specific purpose of being impossible to stop. The monitor blazed a hard, brilliant white, then gave way to the raw command terminal of the primary corporate banking portal. Caleb had poured a fortune into his cybersecurity setup, cloud-based biometric tokens, multi-factor authentication, the most expensive digital lock-and-key system money could buy. In his mind, all of that made him untouchable, a king behind impenetrable walls. What he never grasped was the underlying architecture of the very system he'd tried to steal. The poison pill didn't go anywhere near his gleaming new firewalls. It bypassed the whole modern network, entirely running straight through the original hardwired root access codes I had embedded into the foundational servers 20 years ago with my own hands. His costly security tokens dissolved in front of that master override like tissue paper in front of a blade. A green prompt strobed against the dark screen, calling for the final biometric authorization. I reached forward and slotted a compact fingerprint scanner into the laptop's USB port, pressed my right thumb flat against the sensor. The device murmured softly, cross-checking my identity against the foundational corporate registry buried far beneath every layer Caleb had ever touched. Then a clean electronic chime from the speakers. The last security gateway folded. I was inside, fully embedded in the central international wire system of the Whitmore Commercial HVAC financial network, with absolute unilateral unregulated dominion over every liquid asset attached to the corporate entity. No board, no co-signatures, no one to ask permission from. The poison pill had handed me the authority of a corporate dictator, cutting straight through whatever fraudulent power the sitting CEO imagined he held. I moved through the internal ledgers, quickly skipping past standard operating accounts and going directly for the restricted international holding directories. What Caleb had done to this company was written across the screen in brutal, unambiguous numbers. The primary operating accounts had been gutted, bled out methodically, through a web of fabricated shell companies that existed for no purpose except to funnel the money somewhere he could reach it. The offshore margin debt hung over what remained like a catastrophe waiting to finish the job. I sorted the active transaction queue, zeroing in on the outgoing international wire transfers. The results took one agonizing second to load, then a massive red line entry filled the center of the screen. There it was. A staggering $12,400,000 parked inside a temporary encrypted corporate holding account, quiet as a held breath. That money was the last living pulse of Whitmore Commercial HVAC, 3 decades of frozen job sites, brutal negotiations, and warehouse floors soaked in sweat, all of it condensed into a single number on a screen. Caleb had set the transfer to fire automatically at exactly 8 on Friday morning. The routing pointed directly at a private banking institution, tucked away in the Cayman Islands, untraceable by design. The cold mechanics of what he'd built landed on me like a physical blow. At 8 $12.4 million disappears into the Caribbean. 1 hour on, at exactly 9 his medical crew batters down, My door sedates me and delivers me to the Hollow Creek dementia ward. Two moving parts, perfectly timed, completely without mercy. A cold, crystalline fury climbed up through my chest and settled in my hands, steadying them, narrowing everything down to a single point of focus. Caleb believed he'd backed a broken old man into a corner with no way out. He saw me quietly dissolving into a chemical haze, while he spent the rest of his life on a beach somewhere living off money he never earned and a life he never deserved. My cursor hovered over that $12.4 million wire transfer. Not one flicker of paternal sentiment crossed my mind. Not one breath of remorse. I clicked. A confirmation box materialized on screen, demanding administrative sign-off to permanently cancel the scheduled international transaction. I entered my alphanumeric founder identification code and brought my finger down on the enter key, slow, deliberate final. The red line item vanished from the queue as if it had never existed. The $12.4 million was pulled completely free of Caleb's reach and sealed back inside the protected foundational corporate vault. His escape route was gone, but canceling the transfer wasn't anywhere near enough. I had to make sure Caleb and Vanessa couldn't regroup and launch another assault. I needed them financially paralyzed and helpless before daylight. Back to the primary directory, working through the deep architecture of the corporate's accounts. Caleb had been careless, his greed outrunning his discipline. He and Vanessa had quietly opened a joint personal banking account, a private repository for the consulting fees they'd already embezzled, and the engine funding their extravagant life together. To keep the stolen corporate funds moving freely, they had structured their private banking portal as a direct dependent sub-account, sitting beneath the Whitmore commercial HVAC financial umbrella. They were convinced that holding the chief executive title was all the armor they needed against any internal scrutiny. What they forgot, what never even crossed their minds, was that the poison pill protocol hands the founder unrestricted unilateral reach into every subsidiary account chained to that corporate tax identification number. I cut straight through the secondary firewalls dividing their personal finances from the business network and wired directly into the core of their joint account. The digital ledger filled my screen, a massive, entirely unearned balance constructed on the bones of my stolen labor, my years of sacrifice, and the deliberate exploitation of an old man. I looked at those numbers and felt the cold, satisfying weight of justice settle into my hands. I highlighted the entire directory. Every penny they had hoarded was now in my sights. The balance staring up at me from their private joint account, a staggering $800,000. I held still for a moment, just absorbing the sheer brazenness of that figure. Not a dollar of it had been earned through late nights grinding at the office or hard-won business negotiations. It was accumulated blood money, methodically bled from the primary operating budget across 3 years of quiet, deliberate theft. They had dressed those massive withdrawals up as vendor payments and executive consulting fees, burying their personal lifestyle upgrades deep inside the administrative labyrinth of Whitmore commercial HVAC, imported luxury vehicles, designer wardrobes, lavish European vacations, all of it paid for by the foundation I had spent my life building. That $800,000 was the liquid war chest earmarked to bankroll their tropical escape, while I wasted away in a state-funded psychiatric ward. A surge of cold, entirely righteous rage moved through me. This wasn't just about stopping the Cayman Islands wire transfer anymore. I was going to surgically remove every single asset they had their hands on. And to make sure they could never legally reclaim any of it, Bart and I had spent the previous afternoon constructing something airtight. We didn't walk into some local branch and open a standard holding account. We established a highly complex, bulletproof, irrevocable trust permanently domiciled in the state of South Dakota. That jurisdiction was chosen with precision. Its asset protection statutes are recognized the world over as absolutely impenetrable. The moment those funds crossed into the legal boundaries of that trust, they would become permanently untouchable. The capital reserve would be fully shielded from any corporate bankruptcy proceedings, protected from the federal asset forfeiture that would follow Caleb's offshore wire fraud and sealed against whatever desperate probate challenges my son might try to mount in court. The legal fortress was flawless in every structural dimension. I was completely ready to use it. I turned my focus back to the glowing screen. The laptop's internal processor hummed steadily beneath the rhythm of my own breathing. The master banking portal interface sat there waiting patient and indifferent for me to give the order. I initiated the first step of the termination sequence. I entered the deeply complex, heavily encrypted alphanumeric routing numbers corresponding to the newly formed South Dakota Trust character by character. I checked the verification digits twice, confirming every number in the sequence was exactly right. Then I moved my hand to the mouse, let it rest there for just a moment, and clicked. A protected digital pipeline snapped into place between the compromised Whitmore commercial HVAC servers and the irrevocable trust out west. The banking system then prompted me to consolidate the targeted funds. I merged the $12,400,000 I had just pulled from Caleb's pending Cayman Islands transfer with the $800,000 sitting in Caleb and Vanessa's personal account. The combined total appeared in bold, glowing green text at the center of the dark monitor. $18,200,000. The whole number, the entire sum that was my life's work, reduced to a single figure on a screen. It was the liquid form of 30 years of relentless personal sacrifice, of building a powerful commercial enterprise from nothing with my own hands and my own stubborn will, of pouring everything I had into providing a privileged life for a son who had ultimately decided I was nothing more than an obstacle to be disposed of. I positioned the cursor over the final authorization prompt. I allowed myself one fraction of a second, just enough to feel the full gravity of what was happening. I closed my eyes. I let the weight of the betrayal move through me completely. I thought about the fraudulent Alzheimer's diagnosis they had purchased so casually, like it was a transaction. I thought about the corrupt psychiatrist they had bribed to put his name on their lies. I thought about the private ambulance-armed escorts already scheduled to tear me out of my home in exactly 9 hours. Then I clicked the second time. The transfer was officially authorized. The corporate banking system froze for one long, agonizing second, verifying the biometric override and processing the scope of what I had just done. Then a final warning box appeared dead center on the screen, demanding ultimate administrative confirmation. It stated plainly that this transfer was irreversible and would permanently bypass all standard corporate delay protocols. There was nothing left in me that resembled hesitation. No paternal weakness. No second thoughts. I pressed the mouse button for the third and final time. Click number 3. It was done. I eased back into the leather wingback chair and released a long, slow breath, while the horizontal progress bar crept steadily across the screen, flooding green from left to right. The secure banking server verified the digital handshake. The encrypted financial pipeline sealed itself shut behind the movement of capital. Then the screen went bright with a message that was simple and absolute. Transfer successful. The South Dakota Irrevocable Trust was locked down legally and permanently. Every dollar was now under the exclusive management of an independent third-party law firm with no connection to anyone in this story. Those funds were permanently beyond Caleb's reach, under any legal theory he might construct, reserved solely for legitimate philanthropic purposes and future innocent descendants. He would never see a single cent. I leaned back toward the keyboard and pulled up the primary corporate banking directory for one last look. I needed to witness the damage firsthand. I navigated through the administrative panels and opened the active financial dashboard for Caleb and Vanessa's joint personal account. I hit refresh. The page reloaded across the secure connection in an instant. The $800,000 was gone, wiped entirely from the digital ledger as though it had never been there. The glowing numbers on the high-resolution screen read 0 zircons. A profound silence expanded through the dark room as the full weight of what I had executed settled over everything. They were ruined. Completely. Irreversibly. Come morning, when federal agents finally breached the corporate headquarters, Caleb would discover his Cayman Islands getaway fund had been erased from existence. He would reach for his private accounts to cobble together a legal defense and find nothing but a void. They had spent months engineering a perfectly calculated financial grave built for me, designed to bury me, and with 3 clicks I had rolled them into it instead. The trap they set so carefully had finally closed, just not around the neck they intended. They had manufactured their own destruction, and I had simply provided the final, definitive push. The game they chose to play was finished. The financial ruin was total, but wiping out their stolen wealth wasn't sufficient to settle what they had done. Stripping their money neutralized the escape plan. It did nothing to answer for the fundamental evil of their choices. What they had done demanded a far heavier reckoning. They had weaponized medicine and law against a man who had given them everything. They had coldly arranged to have me imprisoned inside an underfunded psychiatric facility, buried alive in all but name, so they could pillage my life's work without anyone left to object. Financial destruction alone was far too lenient for that degree of cold-blooded calculation. They needed to feel the full crushing machinery of the legal system they had used as their personal instrument. I pulled my eyes away from the zeroed-out account and opened a separate, highly secure digital directory on my encrypted desktop. This was where I kept the arsenal. I organized the complete digital dossier, making sure every piece of evidence was structured clearly enough for a federal prosecutor to follow in sequence. First came the medical documentation. The fraudulent Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, falsified clinical observation records, fabricated memory test results, all of it submitted to the probate court as though it were real. Attached to that, the accounting trail linking a $50,000 cash bribe traced directly from their joint personal account to the private offshore shell belonging to the corrupt psychiatrist. The financial footprint of the conspiracy was unmistakable, a clear, devastating map of premeditated elder abuse and systematic judicial fraud. Second, I folded the crystal-clear audio recordings into the primary evidence folder. That recording had been captured while I sat freezing in the cab of my vintage 1975 Chevrolet pickup truck, deep blue, parked in the far corner of the coffee shop lot. Every damning syllable of their conversation was preserved on it with perfect clarity. Caleb's voice boasting proudly about how he'd locked in the permanent conservatorship through bribery and deception. Vanessa's voice sharp with irritation over the agonizing delays in judicial processing. And most critically, both of them laying out in explicit detail their plan to use a heavily guarded private ambulance to pull me out of my home on Friday morning and seal me inside the dementia ward at Hollow Creek. Hearing their laughter playing back through the laptop speakers did nothing but harden what was already iron inside me. I time-stamped every audio file with precision, building a clear, documented timeline of their premeditated conspiracy. Third came the offshore financial ledgers, massive, catastrophic, and irrefutable. Bart had done an extraordinary job decrypting and organizing the raw data pulled from the subterranean corporate mainframe. The digital spreadsheets laid out Caleb's desperate, incredibly reckless investment losses in brutal detail. They showed exactly how he had leveraged the pristine credit rating of Whitmore Commercial HVAC to illegally secure tens of millions in highly leveraged institutional loans. The ledgers documented his disastrous plunge into unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges operating out of Eastern Europe. The data tracked the $20 million he had completely vaporized in volatile digital assets over the past 8 months. On top of that, I included the urgent margin call notices from the shadow lenders, proof of just how cornered and desperate he had become. And finally, I attached the definitive banking logs showing his ultimate failed attempt to quietly wire the remaining $12,400,000 to his untraceable Cayman Islands refuge. I merged every one of these components into a single, utterly devastating digital dossier. Each file was precisely labeled, cross-referenced against the others, and authenticated directly by the original corporate servers. With the evidence packet fully assembled, the next problem was delivery. A standard corporate email address was out of the question, too easily traced, too much exposure. I needed something that would get the information where it needed to go, without leaving a thread anyone could pull back to me while authorities mobilized. I set up a heavily encrypted decentralized virtual private network, routing my digital signature through dozens of international proxy servers scattered across secure jurisdictions around the world. That layered routing guaranteed complete anonymity, burying my actual physical location inside Bart's dimly lit home office beneath layers of misdirection. Once the secure connection was locked in, I opened a specialized email client built specifically to protect high-level corporate and federal whistleblowers. The interface was sparse and dark functional, down to the bone stripped of every identifying header and tracking element. I began entering the recipient addresses with care. I was going straight to the top of federal law enforcement. In the primary field, I entered the direct tip line for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, routing the dossier specifically to the white-collar crime division. In the secondary field, I entered the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service. They would come down hard on the undeclared offshore wealth and the brazen tax evasion buried inside Caleb's Cayman Islands accounts. I wrote the subject line to be cold clinical and precisely targeted, designed to trigger every high-priority sorting algorithm they had. Massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and illegal cryptocurrency leveraging at Whitmore Commercial HVSE. I attached the full encrypted dossier to the outgoing message and watched the progress bar inch forward as gigabytes of evidence pushed through to the secure federal servers. I read through the concise summary I'd written in the body of the email one more time. It listed the exact names, corporate titles, and home addresses of both Caleb and Vanessa. It outlined the $20 million cryptocurrency fraud and the $50,000 medical bribery scheme in plain, unambiguous language. It spelled out the specific offshore routing numbers used to conceal their stolen wealth. It stated directly that the current chief executive officer had actively defrauded the corporation and was at that very moment attempting to flee the country with stolen capital. My own name appeared nowhere in it. I signed off as a concerned corporate whistleblower and nothing more. The upload finished with a quiet, definitive chime. The digital bomb was fully armed and locked onto its targets. Come 9:00 tomorrow morning, the fake ambulance crew would still pull up to my front door, carrying their fraudulent psychiatric warrant and their sedatives. They would still expect to find a frightened, helpless old man, ready to be hauled away into permanent obscurity. But while they slept, the entire landscape of this war had been remapped beneath their feet. By the time that heavy door swung open, federal machinery would already be moving to grind them to dust. I leaned back in the leather wingback chair, eyes fixed on the glowing blue send button centered on the dark monitor. The winter wind continued beating against the office window outside, but inside me there was nothing but a deep, absolute stillness. I moved my right hand to the mouse and let my fingers settle against the smooth plastic. I placed the cursor directly over the final command. I pressed down. I hit send. The screen reloaded immediately, a simple bright green confirmation filling the display. Message delivered. The federal trap had officially closed around their necks. I remained in the low light of Bart Keegan's office long after that confirmation appeared. The trap was set. I shut the laptop. The soft click landed in the silence like a period at the end of a sentence. Outside, the storm had worn itself out, leaving a frozen stillness draped over the neighborhood. I thanked Bart for standing with me through all of it. He answered with a firm handshake, the kind that carries understanding without needing words. I walked out his front door and into the bitter cold. The air was sharp and clean, scoured out by the blizzard's violence. I got back into the cab of my pickup truck and turned the key. The engine caught with a low, steady rumble, a sound that felt like company in the dead of a winter night. The time for watching from the shadows was finished. I drove through the empty Indianapolis streets at an easy pace, pointed directly back toward the sprawling estate Caleb and Vanessa had taken from me. It was exactly 6:00 in the morning when I turned into the long driveway of what was still by every legal right my home. The massive stone house sat dark and silent against the gray light of breaking dawn, cold and imposing. Caleb and Vanessa were almost certainly still upstairs in the master suite, sleeping the heavy, dreamless sleep of people who believed everything was going their way. They were certain this Friday morning would be the triumphant payoff, the culmination of everything they had schemed and sacrificed to pull off. They fully expected that within 3 hours a medical transport crew would drag me out of my bedroom and deliver me to a state-funded dementia ward to disappear. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand foyer, my boots silent against the imported marble. I moved through the darkened hallways I had memorized over a lifetime, passing the expensive artwork without a single glance of sentiment. This place was no longer my home. It was a crime scene, and soon enough, the federal authorities would treat it as one. I climbed the back staircase quietly and went into my bedroom. From the closet shelf, I pulled down a worn canvas duffel bag. I packed methodically a few changes of durable clothing, my heavy winter boots, the essential documents, my shaving kit. Everything else stayed. The tailored suits, the silk ties, the gold watches, all of it left behind. Those belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. I zipped the duffel bag closed and felt something lift from my chest, a weight I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. I was walking away from the suffocating architecture of their deception, and I felt lighter for it. I carried the bag downstairs and went straight to the custom kitchen. The vast marble island in the center stood completely bare, wiped clean by the housekeeping staff, not a mark on it. It was a perfect surface for what I needed to do. I unzipped the front pocket of the duffel and removed the physical copies of the damning documents. I arranged them across the cold marble with deliberate geometric care. First, directly in the center, the fraudulent medical file. The words, Stage 2, Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, stared up from the paper, a monument to a cruelty that went beyond anything I had words for. Placed squarely on top of it, the detailed invoice from the corrupt psychiatrist, with the $50,000 cash bribe they had paid to chemically imprison me, highlighted in plain sight. Second set, beside the medical file, the forged corporate property deed. I had circled the fraudulent signature at the bottom, the precise forgery Caleb had used to transfer the estate illegally into his own name. I wanted him to look at the physical evidence of the federal felony that would put him in a maximum security prison for the rest of his useful years. Third, I drew my old smartphone from my coat pocket and set it squarely on top of the forged property documents. The device had been wiped clean of all personal data, but the audio application was open on the main screen. I had cued it to the exact digital timestamp of their parking lot conversation. All Caleb had to do was press one button to hear his own arrogant voice bragging about hijacking my corporate empire and arranging my permanent institutionalization. The physical arrangement on the marble island was a masterpiece of retribution, but it still needed one final element to complete the psychological demolition. I reached into the utility drawer and came out with a black permanent marker. I took a blank sheet of stationery from the kitchen desk and laid it flat on the counter beside the documents. I uncapped the marker and drew in a slow breath, gathering myself. Then I pressed the tip to the paper. My handwriting came out sharp and jagged, not one trace of trembling in it. I pressed hard enough that the black ink soaked deeply into the page, each word written at a slow and deliberate pace. I wrote, "Do not bother calling the ambulance." I stopped there, letting the anger move through my arm and into the marker like current through a wire. Then I dropped to the next line and kept going with the same merciless clarity. "And definitely do not bother checking your bank accounts." Short. Brutal. The perfect distillation of their absolute failure. I set the marker down on the counter beside the note. When Caleb and Vanessa finally came down those stairs, fully expecting to watch my medical extraction play out like clockwork, they would not find a helpless, sedated old man. They would find the undeniable physical record of their own destruction waiting for them. In one single blinding moment, they would understand their Cayman getaway fund had been erased, their medical conspiracy had been exposed, and the full armed machinery of the federal government was already bearing down on their front door. I picked up my duffel bag and swung the strap over my shoulder. I did not spare a glance at the grand kitchen or the marble foyer. I walked to the front door and pulled it shut behind me. The latch snapped closed in the cold morning air, sealing the tomb they had so carefully prepared for someone else. Above Indianapolis, the sky was shifting from black to pale blue as the sun pushed up over the horizon. I walked down the driveway and climbed back into the freezing cab of my pickup truck. I threw the bag onto the passenger seat and turned the key. The engine caught hard and strong. I dropped it into gear and pulled away from that estate without a single atom of regret. I wound through the quiet streets and merged onto the open lanes of the interstate. The road unspooled ahead of me, long, clear, and utterly free of the poisonous deception that had consumed so many years of my life. I cracked the window just enough to let the sharp morning air come rushing in against my face. Yes, my wealth was gone. My corporate title was gone, but I had held on to the only thing that had ever truly mattered. I had fought to protect my mind, my sovereignty, and my human dignity against people who had wanted to put me in the ground while I was still breathing. I was free, completely and finally free. The heavy wheels of my vintage 1975 Chevrolet pickup truck, deep blue, ate up the dark asphalt as I merged onto Interstate 65. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I was heading south, putting the brutal Indiana winter and everything that came with it behind me, deeply eager to embrace the brilliant warmth of the southern states. My destination was the bright, sunny coast of Tennessee, somewhere the cold of betrayal couldn't follow. Inside the quiet cab, the only sound was the deep, rhythmic hum of the engine pulling me toward whatever came next. A profound and extraordinary peace had settled into my bones. The crushing weight of the corporate empire was lifted, entirely replaced by something I hadn't felt in years: clean, unencumbered freedom. Then a sharp electronic ringtone cut through the silence and shattered it. The sound came from a cheap, untraceable burner phone sitting on the worn passenger seat beside my bag. I had bought that disposable device with cash just hours before leaving, specifically, deliberately for this moment. I reached over without hurrying, picked it up, and pressed the green button. I brought the speaker to my right ear and said nothing. "Dad, what did you do?" Caleb's voice came through the tiny speaker, cracked wide open with panic. I listened to the sound of his world coming apart at every seam. He was gasping, struggling to pull air in as the reality of his situation pressed down on him from every direction. The composed, arrogant chief executive who had arranged my permanent medical disappearance no longer existed. What was left was a frightened, weeping man who had just realized he had walked straight into a trap with no exit. "But the money is completely gone!" Caleb wailed, his voice climbing into a high, desperate pitch. I tried to initiate the Cayman transfer, but the entire corporate holding account was locked. Then I checked my personal accounts, and the bank says my balance is zero. "We have absolutely nothing left. Dad, please, you have to fix this. The FBI is currently swarming the lobby of the headquarters with federal warrants. They are seizing all the hard drives. You have to help me." I kept my eyes fixed on the long gray highway stretching out ahead, refusing to let his desperation find any purchase inside me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match his frantic energy for even a syllable. I spoke with the cold, settled calm of a man who had clawed his stolen soul back from a very dark place. "You explicitly told me to stop wasting your money, Caleb," I said, keeping my voice smooth and level, letting each word cut through his sobbing like something cold and precise. "I did exactly that. I secured the funds, exposed your medical conspiracy, and handed your illegal cryptocurrency ledgers directly to the federal government. I am simply honoring your request to step aside. Enjoy your bankruptcy, son." I pressed the end button and cut the connection before another word could come through. I wrapped both hands around the cheap plastic phone and snapped it in two. I rolled the driver's window down and let the raw morning air whip hard into the cab. I threw the broken pieces out onto the highway shoulder and watched them tumble and scatter across the gravel and dust in the rearview mirror. The early Tennessee sun was climbing over the far horizon, now throwing long, golden rays straight through the windshield. The warmth landed on my face and began dissolving the last cold residue of the nightmare I had walked out of. I pushed down on the accelerator and drove on into freedom. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Truly. Stories like this one don't get told often enough, and the fact that you're still here tells me something about who you are. Looking back on everything, Gerald went through the frozen accounts, the forged deed, the ambulance scheduled to take him away before sunrise. What strikes me most is not the betrayal itself, but the discipline it took to survive it. He didn't collapse. He didn't confront them in anger and hand them a warning. He gathered every piece of proof, found the one legal mechanism they never thought to look for, and he moved when the moment was exactly right. I believe God gives certain men that kind of patience not to protect them from the fight, but to make sure they're ready when it arrives. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope you carry with you. If you built something from nothing, make sure the legal foundation is as strong as the work itself. A clause no one remembers can save everything. When someone tells you to stop wasting their money, pay close attention. Entitlement that loud rarely stays quiet for long. Document everything before you need it. The person who moves in silence with evidence in hand will always outlast the one who moves fast with nothing but anger. And if the people closest to you are trying to convince you that your own mind has failed, trust your instincts. Get a second opinion, then a third. Your clarity is worth fighting for. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think Gerald did right, or what you would have done differently. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Dad Revenge, so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.